Alice received her BA from the State University of New York in Oswego, her MA from the University of New Hampshire. She's taught around the country at the University of California at San Diego, American University, and has been a writer in residence at Lynchburg and Hollins Colleges in Virginia. She's recently retired from the Richard A. Maskey Professor of Humanities at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and she can share, I think she's even busier now in retirement. We are so fortunate today to have one of America's best female Catholic novelists on our stage to illuminate for us her own musings on the Catholic imagination. Alice's fiction invites us to look at our own lives, our own daily lives, filled with heartbreak and passion as a place where God dwells. We are indeed astonished by love, to borrow her words, when we recognize the sacred in the ordinary. Alice explores the most pertinent themes of our lives, hope, joy, and sorrow, with, as one reviewer said, tenderness, wisdom, and caritas. Please join me in welcoming Alice to the stage.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. I'm sorry, I think Chicago has given me a cold. Michael and I just exchanged a few words that made me think how little patience so many of us have these days with our church and with this moment. So I thought I would just begin today with a few words that actually I composed for a lecture that I just gave down at St. Mary's in South Bend. But I gave the lecture Thursday night. This seems terribly serious for Saturday morning, so forgive me. Some years ago, a brief news item appeared in the Metro section of the Washington Post. It was the story of a young family, mother, father, 2 little boys, who had been caught in the previous day's thunderstorm. The family was taking a Sunday walk in a local park when the storm suddenly arose. As the clouds quickly gathered, the way they do in the mid-Atlantic on late summer afternoons, the family turned to get back to their car, the 2 boys racing ahead on the path. Rain began to fall, those first thick drops that are quickly followed by a steadier downpour. Playfully, the father raced ahead of his 2 sons, and the sons pursued. There was much laughter. And then a crack of thunder and the simultaneous crack of a tree limb. The limb fell, striking the younger boy, knocking him to the ground. It was the father who reached the child first, and he saw immediately that although the boy's body was moving, the blow was fatal. As his wife called 911, the father held his dying, struggling child in his arms. There was nothing else to do, he told the Metro reporter, but to whisper, "Go to Jesus, son," as the boy died in his arms. In the years since I read this report over breakfast coffee on an ordinary morning of my own, I have resisted the impulse to share it. Something exploitive and invasive in the idea of repeating such a story, especially as a means of making a point. But lately, and in this past year especially, I have found myself recalling this incident, this accident, this newspaper anecdote, whenever I am asked to discuss or to defend my faith or the faith of the characters I invent. I think of it too whenever impatience seems to be the deepest emotion I can muster in regard to the current state of the Catholic Church. Because somehow, in the midst of that impatience, in the midst of my own halting attempts to explain the faith of my characters or to retain my own, I can't shake the conviction that nothing in the complex and often terrible, I'm tempted to say increasingly terrible, 2,000-year plus history of Christianity, nothing, no failings, no cruelties, no human error, no evil, can diminish the value, the grace, the immeasurable beauty of the words spoken by that father as he held his dying child. Go to Jesus, son. Words hurled against the meaninglessness, the suffering, the sudden and terrible transformation of that ordinary afternoon. I can't shake the conviction that if the life and death of Christ and the subsequent complicated 2,000-year history of our faith had yielded no other good but those words at that moment, that single moment alone, then it was worth it. All of it. And if that single moment, the stuff of daily newspaper tragedy, was the only moment in the history of time ever to be redeemed from meaninglessness by these words spoken in love and faith, still I would argue for the astonishing beneficence of it. Meaninglessness defeated, human love and human sorrow redeemed by words, by faith. Even if for only that one father and that one child in that one moment, that one story, still I would argue all of human experience that led to that moment is made good by the grace of it. Faith, the language of faith, hurled against the inevitable heartache of the human condition. Words held up against sorrow and human suffering. Of late, and in this past year especially, when I am asked to explain the faith of my characters or my own, or why in the world I seek to remain hopeful about this wounded church, I recall this single incident and I hear myself asking in the accent of my Long Island youth, what else you got? What else have you got that can reconcile the cruelty of our mortal condition with the depth and complexity of our love for one another, even just once? An echo, perhaps, of Peter's words to Christ in John, Lord, to whom shall we go? This, for me, is the essence of both the literary imagination in general and what might be called the Catholic literary imagination in particular. Not only the Christian notion that love redeems us from death, but the storyteller's insistence, equally audacious, that this only needs to happen once, to one parent, one child, in one moment, in one tale, in order for all of human experience, past, present, and future, to be redeemed by the grace of it. I have no worries about the future of the Catholic literary imagination, not only because of the breadth and the brilliance of the writers who were gathered here, but because the impulse to find that transformative moment, the epiphany, the moment of grace, the moment, in Frank O'Connor's words, after which nothing else is ever the same, is a goal, one might say a necessity, of the storyteller's art. The impulse to hurl words against suffering, against meaninglessness, is at the heart, it seems to me, of why we tell stories in the first place. We write stories not only to discover that transformative moment, but also to make that moment, that singular experience, resound, both through the past, the character's history, the novel's history, the world's history, and into the future, into what Isaac Dinesen calls the silence at the end of the story. We construct our stories in the hope of discovering those redemptive moments that justify, make sense of all that has come before and all that follows. For any artist who might possess that extra adjective, that is not only a literary imagination, but a Catholic literary imagination, our pursuit of that revelatory scene, whether it's a climax or a denouement, is informed by what we believe to be that moment in human time when, to paraphrase Seamus Heaney, hope and history rhymed. When death, human suffering, was defeated in real time at the moment of the resurrection. When all that went before, as well as all that would forever follow, was redeemed from meaninglessness. Even the sudden, terrible, nonsensical death of a child in a park on an ordinary afternoon. So I feel the future of the Catholic literary imagination is assured, if only because of the value we place in both faith and literature, and how that faith is aligned. Which brings me to what I do worry about, the future of the Catholic imagination. That is, the imagination of Catholics. To be honest, I am halfway out the door of the institutional church, more than halfway on some days. Or, as I've heard so many fellow Catholics say, especially over the course of this past year, I'm hanging on by my fingertips. For me, especially over this past year, hope has given way to impatience. Institutional corruption has seeped into my spiritual life so that even the effort to forgive the church and to reform it begins to feel more like complicity than compassion. I think it was C.S. Lewis who made the distinction between love and kindness. It is beginning to seem to me a weak need kind of kindness to continue to support the institutional church, an act of love to cry enough and to leave it. And yet both options, to leave the church behind or to endure it as it is, strikes me as a failure of imagination. My own imagination in saying, we can't fix this, without a single attempt to do so. The church's imagination in saying, we fixed it, without a single outward sign of change. A failure of imagination in the insistence of those who have left that there's nothing worth keeping, a failure of the imagination of those who stay, who believe that's what worth keeping is immune from the corruption. All of us failing to see, to picture in our minds, which is in its most basic sense what an act of the imagination is, to picture in our minds a church made new, redeemed by its present state, by the pain it has imposed and by the pain it has endured. All of us, the people of the church, failing to see the potential for transformative grace in this terrible moment, this moment after which nothing else might ever be the same, because our imaginations as Catholics, Catholics out the door and Catholics in the pews and Catholics on the altar and in the Vatican, our imaginations are not up to the task. So every time I hear Catholics say I'm hanging on by my fingertips, my 12 years of hanging out with nuns makes me come up with the obnoxious metaphor, oh, that means prayer. Which is really annoying. But I'm going to close with a prayer. This is a prayer that was composed by a group of Catholic mothers in the DC area who began around my very own dining room table an effort at reform, which they have called the 5 Theses. I love this. They said, Luther had 95. We're working women. We're moms. 5. Just do these. Just 5. It's enough. The prayer borrows from 3 sources, and I love it about it because these are the words of the church. These are the church's words put together in this way. The 3 sources are, first one is the Vatican's 1965 Pastoral Constitution of the Church in the Modern World, which in English was called Joy and Hope. Also the words of the good old Catechism of the Catholic Church, and the words of a marvelous theologian and scientist, Ilia de Leo, who is a sister of St. Francis. This prayer was meant to be offered to every church to be included in the prayer of the faithful. Some churches have taken it. It's aspirational, of course, as all prayer is, but to my mind, it is also an appeal to the imagination. The prayer goes, that from this community of gathered people will rise a new church, a church that protects the abused and the marginalized, ministering to all in search of healing, a church that strives continually to overcome every type of discrimination, whether social or cultural, whether based on gender, race, color, social condition, sexual orientation, language, or religion, in order to pave the way for a new future of joy and hope. We pray to the Lord. Thank you. Happened in late August of last year, the summer of Cardinal McCarrick and the Pennsylvania Report, and just going about my daily business around Bethesda, I was running into friends, many of them Catholic mothers, people I knew from all of us sending our children to Catholic schools from church here and there, and we were all disgusted and despairing. So I just sent an email out to friends and said, we need to vent, come to my house, I'll open a couple of bottles of wine, invite friends, and it was just about 2 days out, 17 women showed up at my door, gathered around my dining room table, all inside the Beltway types, I must say. We had lots of lawyers, teachers, someone from the CIA, one wonderful nun, a theologian, all of us Catholic women involved in the church, many of us mothers, and we did vent. There was a lot of very funny crying out, against what was happening. But then these are the women who also run the church, so they were not going to simply drink wine and talk. Before I knew it, and sort of the miracle of all this is even now,
Yep.
Yes,
Yep.
better?
Yep, better.
Okay. Oh. Wow. Thanks.
Thank you. Sorry about
Over a year later, none of us can say, you did this and then you did this. It was this amazing group effort. And suddenly, in emails and follow-up, this idea of the 5 Theses, this idea of what can we do, began to shape itself. Some people were working on setting up a Facebook page and all those kinds of things that I don't know about. Some getting these sort of homely-looking. The thing that I love, we said, this looks a little bit like a project that Catholic mothers would have done for the parish, And everybody said, yes, exactly, we love that. Don't make it look too sharp. We're up against the CEO speak of the institutional church, and we're speaking from the pews and from the schools and from life. So this developed, a bunch of us went up to the bishop's meeting in November in Baltimore. We actually, we did not nail the 5 Theses to the door of the basilica. We're moms, we use painter's tape. But we pretended just to upset the ushers. Some of the others' moms actually went to the Marriott Hotel, and as the bishops were coming through to their meetings, were handing these things out to them. That I wish I had had a camera following them to say that they were not exactly welcome, but they were moms and they looked harmless, and thought, the bishops just thought they were saying, oh, hello, you know my brother who's a Jesuit, take this. Very subversive group. There's a podcast now being developed, other women's groups, the Women's Ordination Project, the Women Who Stayed, have sort of gathered in. There's a website, all these high-tech things that these ladies know how to do. And it really is a moment of hope, and there's even some joy in it, an effort to reclaim this damaged institution and to make very reasonable demands, but they are a cry for that outward sign of repentance, that outward sign of change, that outward sign of a church that understands how existential this moment is.
Great, thank you. And just the 5, can I read the 5 theses?
Oh, sure,
I love
yeah.
it. Number 1 is full transparency. Number 2 is survivors' voices. Number 3 is simple living. Number 4, put women in church leadership. And number 5, pray for a reformed church. So I think these are topics that we've been talking about over the last few days, and it's just wonderful to hear some imagination in action. So thank you.
Yeah, I think the one item, even more so than putting women in power, which you would think would be the one you would get the most resistance for, the cry for simple living is a request that the church, as an outward sign, at least for a limited time, not forever, get rid of the regalia of the episcopate. Show by, right? A bishop in our area, whose name I will not mention, was on the radio, and one of these moms called in to talk about the 5 theses, and survivors' voices. The suggestion, which I think is a wonderful suggestion, and it's parallel to what the Irish Times did in Ireland, that every diocesan paper gives a page over for the stories of survivors, for survivors to write their own stories. And because it would be a diocesan, a church publication, it would be an indication that the church is listening. Lots of survivors are speaking out and around the church, but this would be, if diocesan papers would say, just briefly tell us your story, we're listening. If you want to do it anonymously, you can do that, which I think it was very healing when it happened in Ireland. So she went through all, and this bishop was, oh, good idea. Yes, of course, yes, we want full transparency. Absolutely full transparency. Yes, oh, survivor, that's a great idea. And then she said, get rid of, the regalia of the episcopate, and there was a pause. And he was like, I'm not giving up my hat. Like, I really worked to earn this hat.
But again, I think it connects to story, and how stories, certainly in your own stories, are a place for healing. I wonder if you could talk a little bit, Alice, hearing that newspaper story that you read at the beginning of your remarks, I think paints a beautiful picture of your craft as a novelist, and how, certainly I think in the 9th hour, that's the moment you bring us to, that a tragic suicide that opens a novel, there's redemption, there's love, there's generations of healing. But you spoke at Dominican a few years ago on the sacramental imagination, and I love this idea. You talked about the Holy Trinity of the narrator, the reader, and the writer. Could you share a little bit about that? And you talked about how a novel happens with that in mind. It was beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, it's again, I use Trinity. It's non-secular, but in some ways, I guess it's the astonishing gift of reading and literature. And when you think about, we do it all the time, maybe without paying enough homage to the act itself, to read, to enter into a book, to enter into a novel, there is the writer's voice. There is the voice with which we speak to ourselves, that inner voice that is never really what we say. I guess you could say it's the thinking voice. And that's the voice we lend to a book when we read it. It's the voice we lend, our inner voice with which we speak to ourselves, to a writer when we read. You can't think about something else and read at the same time. So there's that marvelous intimacy of a single individual, a writer, speaking through a narrator. So there's the third part of the Trinity, speaking through a character, a narrator, using the writer's voice. And that only happens because a reader is generous enough to say, I am giving you the most intimate voice I have to use. Without that, it's simply marks on a page. We all know that. Without that, it's just a crazy person sitting in a room, which writers are, talking to himself or herself and making marks. It takes that Trinity. It takes that generosity of saying, I will lend you this voice to hear yours. So it is that sort of, it's miraculous in many ways. Maybe it's the one thing about being a writer that I've never quite gotten over that anybody actually does read what you write. And it is an act of generosity, and it's an act of community, the most intimate kind of community. So the things that happen in that moment, when reader and writer and narrator are working together, it's not like anything else. It's not like anything else in our experience.
Thank you. I think when you described it too, you talked about it was a friend that you were trying to talk about the Trinity to, but it wasn't someone who was religious, so you couldn't use the shamrock. And,
Right.
I think for artists, what a beautiful image of the Trinity and this idea. Certainly Flannery O'Connor has come up quite a bit over the days, and I know you've pulled ideas from her, but your ability to enter the real world and to penetrate the real to get to God. And again, the newspaper article, the Ninth Hour, but can you talk a little bit about suffering in our world today? How do you penetrate that and come to a place of hope? But the way you connected it so beautifully to our faith, a little bit about suffering in our real world.
A little bit about suffering.
Early in the morning.
Right. The problem of suffering is not one our culture is actively engaged in, sort of ever. It's the very thing that makes me want to apologize. Can we talk about something better, happier? But I do think it is, and again, it speaks so much to narrative, because no, there is no for all time sweeping way to solve that problem of suffering. That we are, as we have been created, or as we have evolved, however you want to look at it, necessitates pain, and we're mortal, and death, and loss, and accident. All those things will never be eliminated, never. They could get better here and there, but never eliminated. So I think, especially thinking about it as a narrative, that's just steady state. Those of us who teach, it's always, well, that's a good idea that you want to write a story about a woman who's a secretary in 1955 in an advertising firm, but what's going to happen? So when you think about the problem of suffering, it's what's going to happen? These characters, they're going to, if they don't die now on page 6, they're going to die at some point, even if the story doesn't. We all know that. And so I think that parallel of the narrative responsibility to find that moment, that's why we tell the story. We don't tell the story to talk about steady state. Well, some people do, but they're really bad storytellers. When you have that, it's like, why are you telling me this? Where is this going? It's the question we ask of every storyteller. It's the question we ask of every joke, every anecdote. And it's that effort to find here in time is something that happened that changed the equation. And somehow that sense of no, didn't end it, didn't say that's solved, let's move on to another problem. Problem of suffering is taken care of. But rather that sense that we have that in this moment, in this single time, it will come and it will go. Proust talked about it, called it true, those moments of true impressions. Those moments, Saul Bellow too has a wonderful sort of explication of it. I think it's in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, when he talks about those moments when the universe seems to be revealing itself to us, and we only see it in glimpses. It reveals itself to us, and then it disappears. But we know we have seen it, and we know it's gone, but we know now that it's possible. And once we have seen it, that glimpse, the universe revealing itself to us, something true that we recognize, even as it passes in time, we know we've been changed, and we can never quite look at life the same way again. That's the essence of storytelling. That's the essence of shaping a narrative. But yet I think it must be also something that's a part of us. It's somehow, it's not just one of us feels that way. We all have these experiences, and certainly we've been brought to these experiences through reading, through that intimate trinity. And so there's this sense that there's something there that wants to be revealed. And then we have that sacramental sense of what is the universe and who's revealing himself.
Wow, that again, that's it. The beauty of you invite us to see, and that is so much of what a good novelist does, but certainly your craft of showing us those moments. And I'll ask one more question, then I'll open it up to the audience. But with that moment in mind, I'm thinking of the ninth hour, and again, the beautiful craft. You use time, you layer through characters' inner lives, and we're moving through generations of a family. But do you have that moment in mind when you start a novel? Does that organically come off the page? I mean, I know I've listened to you say before, sometimes you're as surprised as your reader might be by what you find there. Can you talk a bit about that? I mean, that moment that I think you share with us so well, that transformative moment. Do you start with that in mind? Does it come? Is it a process?
Oh, I think if I started with it, then the work of writing why would I do that? I'd just call up somebody and tell them about that moment. There it is. Let's have lunch. No, I think, and again, I think that's the quest, if you will, of the storyteller. The writer's quest is that we intuit. All of us intuit, not just the artist or the writer or the theologian. We intuit that it's there, and as we shape a story or a tale, we're looking for it. But often it won't happen. So it is that I think it's if there's any reward in this working at words. That's really the only one, when now I see what I didn't know I knew about this story, about these characters. I didn't know it when I began, because that's why I began. But I must have known it. Falling in love is the same thing. Finding a vocation is the same thing. It's that moment when you say, I always knew this, but I didn't know it till now. But I always knew it. I think it's Thornton Wilder who talked about when you say you believe a work of fiction. I believe this. Well, yeah, but it's lies. It didn't really have, no, I believe it. He said, to say you believe is that I recognize that I've always known this. And now I know that I've always known this. So those are those kinds of revelatory moments that we pursue, I think, in the writing process. So that an object that begins just as, they told me I should put lots of detail to make for good writing, use lots of details, so I'm slapping all these details down. And suddenly, and maybe it's years later, months later, pages and pages later, one of them shimmers. One of them connects to something else. And this happens all the time. I don't think in all my years of teaching I've ever had a young writer bring in a draft that didn't have the potential for a connection, for that shimmer of meaning that they didn't even know that they had written. It happens again and again, and it's sort of miraculous. And sometimes you need someone to say, look at this. In light of this, this means something else. So I think we write looking for that.
Wow, it's beautiful. And just before I open it up, a friend and I were talking this morning about the apartment that your characters live in the ninth hour, and we could walk through the hall and the windows at the front and the back and the linen. I mean, those details shimmer for us even years later. The memory and the way you use details to bring us light. So thank you, Alice. I'd like to open it up to the audience now, and Mike has a microphone, and we'll take some time for your questions and comments.
Okay, so I'm almost done with the ninth hour. It's a fabulous book.
Thank you.
I need to tell you that. But I really admire. Well, I'd like to hear about your time with the nuns. But I also really admire how unflinching you are when you describe things. Like the woman on the train to Chicago, or the women on the train to Chicago, but all the caretaking and all the nursing too. And is that something that comes easily to you, or do you have to force yourself to do that?
Thank you. I did not want to write a book about nuns. I really did not want to write a book about nuns. I was not pleased with myself at all when the first nun appeared in the first chapter. And I was grateful that she was old, because I figured, well, I can kill her off by the end. And it won't be a book about nuns. But nuns have a habit. One shows up. They have a habit. One shows up. Couple of others follow, and that's what happened. So I did kill off the first nun at the end of the first chapter, but then I had a very young nun who was going to live a long time, and another that I had to deal with. My editor told me when I sent him the manuscript, and he had no idea what I was doing, and he said he went into the editorial meeting and said, well, Alice has given us a book about nuns. And I guess everybody went, oh. And then he said, but there's a murder in it. And then everyone said, she's lost her mind. But, sure, okay, reconciled to the fact that I was going to be writing a book with lots of nuns in it, and then, that immediately, I'm so tired of the way popular culture has depicted religious women. They're either witches, harridans, bodiless saints who strum guitars, frustrated. But it's not just that I had this obligation to show the nuns as individuals. It's the writer's obligation to show every character as an individual. Even the most stereotypical on the surface must become unlike any other in the pages of a novel. So writing about nuns, especially who were dealing with suffering, who, again, this is the wonderful thing about religious women, so many of I had to start reading. I realized I had to found my own order, because no order really fit into what I wanted the story to do. So I did. I found it. So that made me go out and read a lot about religious women and how do you found an order of religious women. And what I loved was the naming. I mean, I was aware of that as a Catholic, having gone to Catholic schools, but when you really think about the names for the orders, the little sisters, the sister servants, the precious, the sisters of the precious blood, beautiful, and yet all this humility, sort of in the way they name themselves, but then also kind of a tagline, the little sisters of the sick poor. We're not just going to take care of the poor, we are going to take care of the sick poor. We're going to end suffering. We're just little humble, little servants, pay no attention to us. But we're also going to confront the largest problems in the world. So I thought, not only depicting them as individuals, but depicting vividly what it is they were out to do, what it is to deal with human suffering, with the physicalness of it, with the dailiness of it, and not just illness, not just the sick poor, but awful human beings in general. We're horrible, we're terrible, and these women are proposing that they will love us. That they will be there no matter who you are. So the train scene especially, when there's a young character who thinks she's going off, one of the reasons I had to found my own order is that I needed the mother house to be in Chicago, but the sisters were in Brooklyn. And I couldn't find an order that would give me that train ride. So that's one reason why I made up my own. So she's on the overnight train from New York to Chicago, and a woman sits next to her who's just awful. She's just horrible. It was so much fun. I just kept making her worse and worse. And by the time she gets to Chicago, she realizes, I hate people. I don't want to be a nun. People are awful. But on the same hand, it's the sick poor, the suffering poor, they're awful too. They're not all, again, that image of the nun, or the holy dying child, and no, they're awful. They're complaining. They don't like what the nuns are doing for them. They're throwing up. They're having all these bodily things. It's hard and awful work. So to make that vivid seemed to me there was no avoiding it. If I was going to acknowledge that these are real people in individual circumstances in daily life.
My wife Jennifer and I have these 3 nearly grown daughters, and your work has been a real healing strength for us and the family, and a lot of conversation coming out of your work. And so thinking of them, I just wanted to hear from you. They've got this hope and this vitality as they go into the world. With the fracture of the sex abuse crisis, between the fracture that comes up out of that between men and women, where do you see the possibilities of the shimmer of the transcendent?
Thank you. Well, I mean, the practical matter is that the church needs to treat women equally, and that women need to be ordained and participate in the power as much as they participate in the daily life. I mean, come on, it's not so hard. I think Richard mentioned it the other day. Pope Francis could appoint a woman theologian as a cardinal tomorrow. You don't have to be an ordained priest to be a cardinal. That would mean there would be a woman present when the next pope is elected. Even if it's just one, even if it's just a PR gesture, why not do it for us? On the other hand, part of the 5 Theses, but I see this everywhere I go, there's this wonderful sort of groundswell of women who aren't leaving and are saying, damn it, I'm not leaving. It's mine. In the Washington area, there have been monthly masses in homes that are led by women priests, some of the women who were ordained on the Danube. That was many years ago. And they've been lovely, and their Mass, their Roman Catholic Mass, there's communion. But there's also conversations that many of us have had and said, yeah, but we don't want to be in the catacombs. We want our church. One woman said to me, she said, I went to the woman priest mass and it was beautiful, and her homily was one of the best homilies, because women can't preach, one of the best homilies I've heard in ages, and everybody was so wonderful, and there was even a gluten-free host, because women think of everything. And then she said to me, but to tell you the truth, on my way home I stopped by St. Elizabeth's and I lit a candle, because I don't want to join a cult. I want my church. I want my church, the place, the tradition, the things that I love, but I want my place in it. I don't want to be driven out. So somewhere in that intersect, I think there's hope. A very dear friend of mine, who's a Monsignor in the Brooklyn Diocese, he's 93 years old. About 15 years ago, I said to him, Father George, when are we going to get women priests? And he said, 2 more popes. And then Benedict got elected. And I saw him again, and he said, 4 more popes.
Continuing with this concern, because it isn't just women who feel that way. Men, women, adult children feel that way. We are the church. And the little I know of what's happening with the bureaucracy actually comes from the New York Review of Books, so it may or may not be true. But Francis started strong, and the more recent take on it is that, deep state at the Vatican that is surrounding Benedict is actually really holding things back. So the obvious question here is, and my own frustration, how do all of us Catholics actually not have independent, wonderful groups in the Beltway, or what kind of national network, something like a union where the church could rise up nationally and support something that is very progressive? Because unless we have a national groundswell, I think Francis will just go under. So I think it's up to us to get some kind of national umbrella network to claim back our church.
Well, there is a groundswell, but it's a groundswell leaving. The groundswell is the numbers of practicing Catholics diminishing, and especially among the younger generation. Even in Catholic universities, the kids who check none of the above for religious affiliation is increasing. That's the groundswell, and that's what the institutional church is not getting. This is an existential moment. I say in all honesty, because I'm in this Catholic thing, but I have a very hard time going to Mass. I lived through, the first abuse crisis, and I lived through horrible, scary nuns in 7th and 8th grade, all those. I have never in my life as a Catholic felt I can't find comfort in the Mass. And I think that's happening to a lot of us. We're overwhelmed, it's too much. I don't know that there's a national groundswell that this institution will listen to. And I do think it's the small groups. We're going back to our roots. We're going back to the beginnings, wherever 2 are gathered. And I think it has to be everywhere. Small groups talking to each other. We have enough of the institution. We have enough of the guys with the big hats who sit on the thrones and tell us what to think and tell us what to do. I do think it needs to be, and it will take time, obviously, it's God's time, but I think it has to be among people speaking honestly to each other. As soon as you get that national umbrella, you get what we're up against. We're up against CEO speak. I did an onstage, I interviewed Cardinal Dolan of New York on stage at the Irish Art Center last fall. And oh my gosh, what a slippery CEO he is. It was just, I would not have thought, except for our references, that I was talking to a man of faith. I was talking to the head of an institution. It was very good and very charming, obviously, but there was I don't think that's going to solve it.
I guess what I'm emphasizing the wrong word. Is there a way to network those sincere groups that would, in a way, do an end run around the party?
I think it's happening. And again, it's just this little group that started in Washington. Women's Ordination Project joined with them. The Women Who Stayed joined with him. Voice of the Faithful. I mean, there are all kinds of, and because of the good things about the internet, there's all kinds of exchanges going on. But I think it has to come down to individual parishes. The parishes are feeling it financially, but I don't think they're feeling it experientially. They're not seeing the members of the parish standing outside the church, what some people have called to do. Pray outside your church. Don't stay home and pray. Don't gather away. Stand outside your church and say, I'm not comfortable praying in my own church, in my own home. Let me back in. But I do think it's got to come from individuals gathering, individual parishes. I don't think meeting the institution with another kind of institution is going to get us anywhere. Then too many Catholics will look and say, oh, they're taking care of it. It's time for we are the church. And it's time for every single one of us to remember that and not simply hope that somebody else is out there doing it. I hate to say that because I hate doing things like this. I want to stay home and write. I don't want to be an activist for the Catholic Church. It's the last thing I want to do. But it's time.
I think we have time, Alice, for one more. We have one question over here.
Sorry, this may be a terrible last question, but I ask for the sake of, not myself, but faithful Catholic women that I know who would say that they don't want women to be priests and that they find their role and fulfillment in the church in other ways. And I don't know, I can't speak for them on all the depth of that, but what would you say to women who see themselves as faithful Catholic who then don't think that that is the way to restore the church and who see an older restoration of orthodoxy as the way to be inclusive and reform the church? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly heard from such women. Mostly I have heard about such women through men who have told me about them, which immediately makes me suspicious. I can't say I've met that many personally. I mean, the simple answer is it's wrong. It's wrong. Gender discrimination is wrong. For our church to say that only the male can be ordained is a violation of human rights. It's wrong. I don't care if, there were people good people who argued for slavery, and had a good point to make about it and didn't want things to change. The church needs to, the thing I often hear, or that again has come through this public work, women priests, that's okay in the United States, but it'll kill the church in Africa. It'll kill the church in South Africa, in South America. It's still wrong. It's still wrong. It's still wrong to say to one person, you are not admitted because you are female. And the church still is missing out on the gifts that a woman can bring to preach, to ordain, to hear confessions, to be there when a pope is the woman's voice. Orthodoxy got us here. It didn't work so well. There is that, sometimes there's just that, I thought we're supposed to know what's right and wrong. I thought you were supposed to guide us in that. The cultural problems, we'll work them out. The people who are angry, I remember as a kid how many people were going to leave the church because we didn't have Latin masses anymore. They got over it. The opening chapter of my novel deals with a suicide and the problem that the boy who committed suicide could not be buried in a Catholic cemetery. Those were the rules in the early part of the 20th century. And you know what? The church changed them. The church understood that suicide is not a sin. Science told us we changed. I don't know a single Catholic, and maybe you have stories, who said, I had to leave the Catholic Church because once they said you can bury a suicide in Catholic cemetery, I lost my faith. You know, I grew up, the church told me suicides can't be buried, and then they changed the rule, and that shook me to my core. No, it changed. It was a good change. We all recognize that was wrong, this is right. You know, we're afraid of change. This church especially is afraid of change, but it's simply a basic question. Are we a good people? Then we should behave that way.
Alice, thank you.